The monk was looking at him with the kind of stillness that belongs to men who have decided a long time ago not to speak. He was old, perhaps 70, with the shaved head and saffron robe of his order, sitting cross-legged on a mat in the open-sided sala of a monastery 30 kilometers outside the town of Savannakhet in the Laotian Panhandle in the spring of 1993. The American across from him, a junior political officer named Dale Murchison, had just asked the monk in stumbling Lao whether he had any family, and the monk, without changing expression, had answered in English. He had said, "No, sir, not for a long time." And then he had closed his mouth, as if he had bitten down on something hot. We'd love to know where you're listening from. Leave a comment and tell us. And a big thank you to everyone supporting the channel with a subscription. Murchison froze. He was 34 years old, 2 years out of language school, on his first overseas posting, and he had been sent up from the embassy in Vientiane to deliver a small grant for the restoration of a stupa, the kind of soft power errand that nobody wanted and that fell, therefore, to the most junior officer on the political section. He had not expected anything. He had eaten a bowl of sticky rice with the abbot, taken photographs of the cracked plasterwork, drunk weak tea, and made polite small talk about the rains. The old monk had been pointed out to him almost as an afterthought, as the abbot was walking him back toward the dirt track where his land cruiser was parked. "That one over there," the abbot had said in French. "He came to us long ago. He does not speak much." What stopped Murchison was not the English, it was the accent. It was flat, unmistakably American, and underneath the flatness there was a particular drawl, a stretching of the vowel in long that he had heard 1,000 times growing up in Amarillo. It was a Texas voice. It was a panhandle voice. It belonged to a man who had said, "Sir, yes, sir," in a high school cafeteria somewhere west of the Pecos River, and had not, by any reasonable measure, ever left it. Murchison kept his face still. He had been trained for this in a very general way, the training that political officers receive about strange encounters in strange places, and his training was telling him to be calm and to ask one more question and to see what came back. He asked, in English now, "Where are you from, friend?" The monk looked at him for what felt like a long time. A gecko clicked twice on the wooden ceiling. Outside the open wall of the sala, a young novice was sweeping the courtyard with a bundle of twigs, and the dry rasp of it was the only sound in the world. The monk said, in Lao, that he was called Pra Samdet, that he had taken his vows many years before, and that he did not remember the place of his birth. He said it slowly and without inflection, the way a man recites a thing he has rehearsed. He then bowed his head and would not look up again. Murchison sat for another minute. He understood, in the way that field officers come to understand things without being told, that he had walked into the edge of something he did not have the clearance or the experience to handle. He thanked the monk. He thanked the abbot. He walked out into the white midday glare and got into the land cruiser and told his driver to head back toward the highway, and as the dust rose behind them, he opened his green field notebook and wrote down everything the old man had said, and what his accent had sounded like, and the position of the sun in the sala, and the smell of the place, which had been incense and damp wood, and something underneath that, something like an old man who had not bathed in several days. He wrote down the words Texas and white skin and English and roughly 70 years old. He underlined the word 70. That night, back at the small guest house in Savannakhet town where the embassy kept a standing room, Murchison sat at a wooden table under a single fluorescent tube and drafted a cable to the defense attaché's office in Vientiane. He kept the language careful. He had learned in language school that the worst thing a junior officer could do was to send a cable that sounded excited. He wrote that during a routine site visit to a monastic community in Savannakhet province, Source had observed an elderly male Caucasian individual living as an ordained monk who responded briefly in fluent American-accented English before reverting to Lao and declining further conversation. He wrote that source assessed the individual to be approximately 70 years of age and of probable American origin. He recommended that the matter be referred to the Defense POW/MIA accounting office in Honolulu for evaluation. He sealed the cable and walked it down to the embassy comms room the next morning when he got back to the capital. The duty officer read it twice and looked up at him and said, "You are sure about this, Murchison?" And Murchison said, "I am sure about the accent." The cable went out at 1400 hours local time. It would be 4 months before anyone with the authority to act on it set foot in that monastery again. By then, the old monk would be gone, and the only thing left in his cell would be a single small piece of metal, blackened with age, on which were stamped the words Sitton, Wayne, A, followed by a service number and the letter O for blood type, and a religious preference of no pref. How a dog tag belonging to a door gunner who had gone down in a Huey over the Sekong watershed in the early months of 1971 had come to be lying on a sleeping mat in a Laotian monastery 22 years later was a question that nobody, in any office, in any capital, was prepared to answer. The orders came in on a piece of mimeographed paper that smelled of solvent and was already smudged before the briefing officer handed it to them. The men of the 2nd Aviation Company called themselves the Ghosts because somebody in the previous rotation had painted a sheeted figure on the nose of a slick and the name had stuck, and they had inherited it the way you inherit a dog, without choosing it and without quite being able to give it back. It was the late autumn of 1970. The company was attached to a forward operating area on the western edge of the Republic of Vietnam, in a part of Quang Tri province where the laterite ran red and the hills rose toward the Annamite chain in long, slow, steaming green folds. The base was a strip of pierced steel planking laid down on flattened earth, with revetments of sandbag and timber for the aircraft, and a row of plywood hooches for the crews, and a mess hall with a corrugated tin roof that drummed like a kettle when the rains came. The rains came almost every afternoon. The men of the Ghost Company had stopped commenting on it months before. Aircraft Commander Curtis Weems was 26 years old and on his second tour. He was from a town in eastern Tennessee that had lost 3 of its sons in Korea, and now appeared to be losing a couple more in this one. And he wore the calm of the man who had decided early on that he was not going to be one of them and had not yet been proven wrong. He was tall, lean, with sun-bleached hair he kept short under his flight helmet, and he flew the UH-1H Huey with the slightly bored precision of a man driving a familiar truck down a familiar road. His co-pilot was Warrant Officer Roy Thibodeau, a Cajun from the parish country south of Lafayette, 23, a talker, a card player, a man who could make a whole hooch laugh with a single observation about the food. The two of them had been flying together for 4 months and had reached the wordless understanding that good crews reach, where one of them would put a hand on the cyclic and the other would already be reaching for the collective, and neither of them would have to say a thing. The crew chief was Specialist Glenn Hargrove, 21, from a wheat farm outside Hutchinson, Kansas. He kept the aircraft running. He was the one who climbed up on the transmission deck in the dark with a flashlight clenched in his teeth, who knew the sound of every bearing in the rotor head, who could tell from the change in vibration through the floor plates that something had gone subtly wrong 3 minutes before any instrument would catch it. He spoke very little. He wrote letters home in a small, careful hand on yellow legal paper and mailed them in plain envelopes. And he kept a photograph of a girl named Ruby Lee taped to the inside of his footlocker. The door gunner was Wayne Sitton, 20 years old, from El Paso, Texas, on the bank of the Rio Grande, where his father drove a truck for a feed company and his mother taught Sunday school at the Baptist Church on Montana Avenue. Sitton had enlisted out of high school. He was the youngest man on the crew. He had the easy slouch and the slow grin of a West Texas kid, and when he laughed with his whole body, head thrown back, and the other men of the Ghost Company liked him without reservation, which is a thing that does not happen often in any army. He carried a Zippo with the words El Paso High School, Class of '68, engraved on it, and he flicked it open and shut when he was bored, which in the Army was nearly always. The four of them had a Huey that they had named, in violation of every regulation, the Lone Star Lady. Hargrove had painted the words in small letters under the pilot's window, where you would not see them unless you were looking. The aircraft was a UH-1H manufactured in Fort Worth with a tail number that ended in 273, and it had 840 hours on it when the orders came in. What the orders said, more or less, was that the Lone Star Lady and her crew were assigned to a mission package designated by a code name that the briefing officer pronounced, without expression, as Crimson Meridian. They were to report to a particular hut at 0400 the following morning, where a Special Forces captain would brief them on a single-ship insertion of a 6-man recon team into a target area west of the border. West of the border meant Laos. Laos was, officially, a place where American aircraft did not go. The men of the Ghost Company knew this in the way that all men in all armies know the official version of things, which is to say, they knew it for the polite lie that it was. Aircraft from their company had been crossing the line for months. The crews had a name for it. They called it going to the dance. Weems folded the mimeographed paper into a neat square and put it in the breast pocket of his flight suit. Thibodeau looked at him sideways and said, "Well, hell, Podna." Hargrove said nothing. Sitton, sitting on the edge of his cot with his boots off and a paperback novel in his lap, said quietly, "My mama is not going to like this one." None of them laughed. The rain started up on the corrugated roof, and from somewhere, 2 hooches over, the radio was playing "Have You Ever Seen the Rain?" And the four of them sat in the dim afternoon light and listened to John Fogerty sing about something none of them could quite name. And outside, the laterite turned to mud, and a Huey from another flight came in low over the wire with its rotor whump beating against the tin roofs of the camp. They did not know it then, and there was no reason for them to know, but the Lone Star Lady had 11 days left to fly. The briefing hut had no windows. It was lit by a single bare bulb hanging from a wire, and the air inside it was thick enough to lean against, a compound of cigarette smoke and damp canvas, and the particular sour smell of men who have not slept enough. On the plywood wall, a 1 to 50,000 topographic map had been pinned up, and across the center of it, where the green of the mountains gave way to the blue of a river drainage, someone had drawn a red circle with a grease pencil, and inside the circle they had written nothing at all. The briefing officer was a Special Forces captain whose name patch had been removed. He was in his early 30s, lean and weather-cured in the way of men who had spent too much time at altitude in the highlands, and he stood beside the map with a wooden pointer in his right hand and a manila folder in his left. The folder was stamped, on the cover, with words that nobody in the room was supposed to read aloud, and it had been hand-carried from a building in Saigon that did not, on any organizational chart, exist. The 4 men of the Lone Star Lady sat on metal folding chairs in a half-circle, Weems in the front, with his flight helmet on his knees, Thibodeau beside him, chewing a piece of gum with mechanical patience, Hargrove behind them, his arms folded across his chest, Sitton at the end of the row, the youngest, sitting up very straight, the way a man sits when he is trying not to look young. The captain began without preamble. He said the operation was designated Crimson Meridian. He said the package consisted of a single UH-1H to insert a 6-man special reconnaissance team into a target area in the eastern Laotian panhandle, in the watershed of the river Sekong, in the province known as Saravane. He said the team's mission was to observe and report on truck traffic moving south along a particular stretch of road that the enemy had not, until recently, been believed to be using in significant volume. He said the team would carry rations for 10 days and would be extracted at a primary landing zone, or at one of two alternates on the morning of the 11th day. He gave the call signs. He gave the radio frequencies. He gave the authentication procedure. He did not give a precise grid, and what coordinates he did give were spoken once and not written down. He moved the pointer to the red circle on the map. He said, "The only thing you need to know about this area, gentlemen, is that we believe the enemy has recently moved a battalion of anti-aircraft into the high ground here, in a configuration that we have not previously encountered in this sector. We have no confirmed visual on these positions. The recon team's secondary mission is to confirm or deny their presence. Your job is to put the team in and then get out, and to do both of those things without being seen." Weems, who had said nothing through any of this, raised one hand the way a man raises a hand at a town meeting. He said, "Sir, with respect, what is the weather call for tomorrow morning?" The captain looked at him for a moment and then looked at the folder. He said, "The weather call is marginal. There is a cell of low ceiling and reduced visibility moving down out of the north overnight. The mission window opens at 0545 and closes at 0700. We are flying inside that window." Thibodeau made a small sound through his nose. Weems did not look at him. Weems said, "Sir, marginal in the panhandle in November is not marginal. It is the inside of a milk bottle. If we have AAA on the ridges and we are flying nap of the earth in the soup, we are going to come out of a cloud right on top of a 57 millimeter, and we are going to have approximately 1½ seconds to do something about it." The captain set the pointer down on the table beside the folder. He said, "Mr. Weems, I am not asking your opinion on the weather. I am giving you a mission. The mission has been approved at a level that neither you nor I have the privilege of questioning. You will fly the mission as briefed." There was a silence. Hargrove in the back row uncrossed his arms and crossed them again. Sitton looked at the floor. Outside the hut, somewhere on the flight line, a turbine was winding up, the high, thin whine of an Allison T-53 coming to life, and the sound of it filled the hut and then receded. Weems said, "Yes, sir." The captain handed across a single sheet of paper, the operational fragment, the part of the order that the crew was permitted to carry on their persons. Most of it had been struck through with a heavy black marker. The call signs were legible. The radio frequencies were legible. The grid for the insertion landing zone was given as a 6-digit number with the first 2 digits redacted. At the bottom of the page, in a different hand, someone had written, "Recover at all costs." The 4 men walked out of the hut into the pre-dawn dark. The rain had stopped. The flight line smelled of JP4 and wet sandbags and, faintly, of the latrine downwind. The Lone Star lady was sitting in her revetment with her rotors tied down, and a fueler in a soft cap was just stepping back from the port side filler. Hargrove walked over and began his pre-flight without speaking. Sitton fell in beside Weems as they crossed the PSP. He said, "Real quiet, sir." Weems looked over at him. Sitton said, "I got a feeling about this one. The kind I had the day my cousin Earl drowned at Galveston." Weems stopped walking. He looked at the kid for a long moment in the blue light before dawn. He said, "Wayne, you keep that to yourself. You hear me? You do not say that to Hargrove, and you do not say that to Roy. You climb in that aircraft and you do your job, and we will all be eating powdered eggs in the mess by 0900. You hear me?" Sitton said, "Yes, sir." But he did not look at Weems when he said it, and his hand was already in his pocket, and his thumb was already on the lid of the El Paso High School Class of '68 Zippo, and he was flicking it open and shut, and the small metallic click of it followed them all the way out to the aircraft in the dark. The rotor began to turn at 0453. Hargrove was on the intercom calling out the start, and Thibodeau had his hand on the throttle, and the Allison was lighting off with the long ascending shriek that anyone who has ever stood near a Huey at start carries in his head for the rest of his life. The blades came around slow at first, then faster, the heavy chop of them building into the steady whump, whump, whump that filled the revetment and shook loose dust off the sandbags. The recon team was already aboard. 6 men in tiger-stripe fatigues, no name tapes, no rank, faces darkened with green and black grease, sitting on the floor of the cargo bay with their rucks between their knees. They were a special reconnaissance team out of a unit that did not officially exist, and the Lone Star Lady's crew did not know any of their names and had not asked. The team leader, a stocky man with a heavy mustache, sat just behind Hargrove's gun position and looked straight ahead at nothing. Weems came up off the revetment floor at 0458 and brought the aircraft into a low hover over the PSP, and Thibodeau called the tower in a voice flat with the early hour, and the tower, which knew nothing of Crimson Meridian and had been told to clear them on request and ask no questions, came back with a single word that meant go. Weems pushed the cyclic forward, and the Lone Star Lady slid out over the wire of the fire base and dropped her nose toward the dark country to the west. The country at 400 feet was a black ocean with islands of mist. The moon was a thin paring low in the southwestern sky and gave almost no light. To the east, behind them, there was the faintest lifting of gray along the horizon, the first indication of a sun that would not actually rise for another 40 minutes. Thibodeau had the map on his knee under a red-lensed flashlight and was calling the headings in the calm patois that he reserved for the cockpit. 275, Podna. Hold 275. Weems flew the headings. They crossed the border at 0511. There was no marking on the ground. There was no fence. There was only Thibodeau's finger on the map, and the small mental adjustment that every crew made at that moment. The adjustment of knowing that they had just gone, as the company called it, to the dance. Weems took the aircraft down to 100 feet above the canopy, which in the panhandle of Laos meant about 500 feet above the ground, because the canopy itself was 400 feet of triple-layer hardwood. The Lone Star Lady began to thread westward up a long valley, following the shape of a river that Thibodeau could not always see, but could infer from the parting of the mist. Hargrove, on the port side, had his M60 out of its mount and was holding it at the low ready, the barrel angled down through the open door, his eyes moving across the dark mass of the trees below them. Sitton, on the starboard side, was doing the same. The wind through the open doors was cool, almost cold, and it carried the smell of the jungle, which is the smell of wet leaves and decomposing wood and standing water and, very faintly, of wood smoke from cooking fires that they could not see. The intercom was quiet. Nobody talked on a run-in to a target area. There was nothing to say. Weems took her up over a saddle at the head of the valley. The saddle was 2,400 feet on the chart, and as they crossed it, the Lone Star Lady went briefly into the bottom of a cloud, and the world outside the windscreen disappeared into a wet gray nothing, and Weems was flying purely on instruments for perhaps 15 seconds, and then they were out the other side, and the next valley opened up below them, longer, deeper, and at the far end of it, miles ahead, there was a faint horizon line that meant the open country of the Sekong. It was at this moment, as they cleared the saddle, that Thibodeau reached forward and snapped off the AFVN signal that had been bleeding faintly through one of the secondary radios. He had left it on out of habit. The song that had been playing was "Have You Ever Seen the Rain?" the same song that had played in the hooch the previous afternoon, and Thibodeau had felt for a moment a small, irrational uneasiness at the coincidence and had reached up and silenced it. He went over to the tactical frequency and waited. The recon team leader leaned forward and tapped Weems on the shoulder. He held up 2 fingers, then the flat of his hand. 2 minutes. Hot LZ procedure. Weems nodded once and brought the cyclic back a degree, slowing them. The LZ was a clearing on a long bench above the river, perhaps 50 meters by 30, surrounded on 3 sides by the green wall of the canopy, and on the 4th by a slope dropping toward the water. Thibodeau had it on the map, had been calling the run-in for the last 2 minutes, and at 1 minute out, he pointed it out to Weems through the windscreen, a paler patch in the dark. Weems came around in a long, shallow turn to bleed off speed. Hargrove and Sitton both had their guns up now, scanning the tree line. The Lone Star Lady touched down at 0541. The recon team was off the aircraft in less than 8 seconds, 6 men moving out of the doors in 2 files, low, fast, professional, and into the tree line on the western edge of the clearing, and gone. Hargrove gave Weems the all-clear. Weems pulled pitch. It was as the aircraft was coming up through about 30 feet that the first round hit. It came from the high ground to the north, from a position that was not on any briefing map, and it punched through the lower fuselage on the port side with a sound that was not loud exactly, but that everyone aboard felt through the seat of their pants as a small, hard thump. Hargrove said, on intercom, real calm, "We are taking fire from the 9 o'clock high." What he did not say, because he did not yet know it, and what nobody on the aircraft yet knew, was that the round had passed through the cargo bay floor at an angle and had clipped the lower portion of the tail rotor drive shaft on its way out the other side. The Lone Star Lady made it perhaps 700 meters from the LZ before the tail came apart. The drive shaft, weakened by the pass-through of the round, held under load for somewhere between 90 seconds and 2 minutes, which was long enough for Weems to clear the bench and start the climb back toward the saddle, and not long enough for him to do anything else. Then it failed. The failure was not gradual. The failure was a sudden, shrieking disengagement of the tail rotor from the engine, and the immediate consequence of the failure was that the torque of the main rotor began to spin the fuselage around its own vertical axis in the direction opposite to the blades, which is to say, hard and fast to the right. Thibodeau said on intercom, in the same flat patois as before, "Oh, podna." Weems was already chopping the throttle and lowering the collective, the textbook response, the only response, dumping power to kill the torque and entering an emergency auto-rotation. The shrieking from the tail boom continued. The aircraft was now spinning in a slow, sickening yaw as it descended, the canopy below them rotating past the open doors, the green wall of the trees coming up at them like the rim of a bowl. Thibodeau was on the radio. He had the tactical freak up, and he was calling, in a voice that was, all things considered, remarkably level, "Ghost 6, Ghost 6, this is Lone Star 273. We are going down. We are going down. Position is approximate north-northeast of the insert LZ on bearing 010. Taking ground fire. Mayday, mayday, mayday." Hargrove had pulled himself back from the gun and was bracing in the doorframe. Sitton, on the other side, had done the same. Both of them had their feet against the bulkhead, and both of them had their hands on the structural tubing, and neither of them was saying anything. The Lone Star Lady went into the canopy at an attitude of about 30 degrees nose down and yawed perhaps 120 degrees to the right of her original heading. The first contact was with the upper branches of a large hardwood, which sheared off the main rotor blade nearest the trees in a single crack like a rifle shot. The second contact was with the ground. What happened on the ground was, in the strict sense, never reconstructed. The following is the complete reconstructed text of the after-action transcription as it appears in the partially declassified Joint Personnel Recovery File. Document number redacted. Pages 3 through 7 not present in the released materials. 0551. Lone Star 273 transmits. Ghost 6, Lone Star 273, going down, Mayday, mayday, mayday. Position bearing 010 from primary. Taking fire from the high ground to the north. Will attempt AUT. Transmission cuts. 0551 plus 30 seconds. Ghost 6 attempts contact. Lone Star 273, Ghost 6. Say again your last, Lone Star 273, Ghost 6. No response. 05:52 through 06:14. Ghost 6 continues attempts at 30-second intervals. No response. 06:15. Ghost 6 contacts higher. Be advised, Lone Star 273 is overdue and non-responsive following Mayday transmission. Request scramble of search package. 06:41. Second UH-1H designated Ghost 46 lifts from the forward operating area with intent to overfly the area of last reported position. What follows next in the transcript is one of the strangest entries in the file. Page 9 of the after-action document, the only page from that section that survived declassification in legible form, contains a notation by the radio operator at Ghost 6. The notation reads, transcribed verbatim. At 08:23, Ghost 46, in the search area approximately 3 clicks north of primary insertion LZ, reports brief intercept of unidentified voice transmission on the company tactical frequency. Voice was male, English-speaking, weak signal, broken by static. Ghost 46 pilot Mr. Earl Vandermeer subsequently asserted under debriefing that the voice was, in his opinion, that of door gunner Wayne A. Sitton of Lone Star 273, with whom Mr. Vandermeer had served for approximately 5 months, and whose voice he stated he could identify with certainty. Mr. Vandermeer reports the transmission consisted of a single phrase, which he wrote down in his kneeboard at the time. The phrase as recorded by Mr. Vandermeer is as follows: "Tell my mama I am going to walk." The transmission was not heard again. Ghost 46 was unable to establish further contact and was unable to locate a wreck site despite 3 passes over the suspected area at varying altitudes. Ground fire was light to moderate from the high ground to the north. Ghost 46 returned to base at fuel state minimum. End of fragment as released. In the 72 hours that followed, 4 additional aircraft attempted searches of the area. None of them found a wreck. None of them established further radio contact with any element of the Lone Star 273 crew. The triple canopy of the Annamites was, as it had been for every search before this one, and would be for every search after, a green ocean that did not give back what it took. And the Lone Star lady, with her tail number ending in 273, and her hand-painted name under the pilot's window, was simply gone, as if she had never lifted off the PSP at all. Earl Vandermeer flew the rest of his tour. He never recanted what he had heard on the radio. Years later, after he had left the Army and was working as a crop duster in central Iowa, he would tell an interviewer from the National League of Families, in the only on-the-record statement he ever gave about the matter, that he was as sure of what he had heard on the morning of the loss of the Lone Star lady as he was of his own name. He would say, "I knew that boy's voice. I knew it like I know my brother's." He said, "Tell my mama I am going to walk." Now you tell me what that means. You tell me what a man means by that. Because I have been trying to figure it out for 23 years, and I cannot. The telegrams went out in the 3rd week of the loss. There were 4 of them. They were composed at a desk in the Department of the Army Casualty Office and transmitted, by Western Union, to 4 cities and 4 small towns across the United States. The wording was identical in every case except for the name and the rank and the unit and the next of kin. The wording said that the Secretary of the Army regretted to inform the recipient that their son or husband had been determined to be missing in action as the result of hostile action in Southeast Asia on a particular date in early 1971, and that all available efforts were being made to determine his status, and that further information would be forwarded as it became available. The telegram that went to El Paso was delivered at 12 minutes past 11 in the morning, on a Tuesday, to a small stucco house on Robinson Avenue, 4 blocks north of the high school, whose name was engraved on Wayne Sitton's Zippo. The Western Union man rang the bell and was met at the door by Mrs. Vera Sitton, 46 years old, a Sunday school teacher, who took the telegram and read it standing in her own front hallway and did not at first sit down. She read it a second time. Then she went into the kitchen and sat at the kitchen table in the sun, and she did not move from the table until her husband, Hollis Sitton, came home from the feed company at 6 in the evening and found her there. She had not turned on a light. The telegram was on the table in front of her, smoothed flat, with both of her hands resting on it. She told Hollis, in a voice that she had spent the entire afternoon practicing, that they had lost him. Hollis Sitton sat down across from her and put his hands on the table. He said after a long time, "Missing in action is not the same as killed in action, Vera." She said, "Hollis, I know what missing in action is. The telegrams to the other 3 families produced their own separate scenes in their own separate kitchens, their own separate hallways, their own separate moments at which a particular sentence, formed in a particular order of words, entered a particular house and rearranged the rest of its history." Curtis Weems, Sr., in the eastern Tennessee town that had already lost 3 men in Korea, read his telegram on the front porch. Pearl Thibodeau, in the parish country south of Lafayette, read hers in the kitchen of the small Creole cottage where her son Roy had grown up. Edna Hargrove, in the wheat country outside Hutchinson, Kansas, read hers on the front step of the farmhouse her husband had built in 1946. In the months that followed, the families learned what missing in action meant in administrative practice, which was that the United States government would conduct, on their behalf, a continuing assessment of the available information regarding their loved ones, and would update them periodically, and would not, except in the most exceptional of circumstances, declare those loved ones to be killed in action without further evidence. What this meant in practice for the families of the Lone Star Lady was that for the next several years they received, at irregular intervals, letters from the Army informing them that no new information had been developed. The letters were polite. The letters were signed. The letters said nothing. In 1973, when the prisoners came home from Hanoi in the long line of C-141s landing at Clark Air Base, the families of the Lone Star Lady stood by their televisions and watched the men coming down the steps of the aircraft and waited to see 4 particular faces. The 4 faces were not there. They were not there because no Vietnamese prison list of any of the lists released or leaked in the years that followed ever contained the names Weems or Thibodeau or Hargrove or Sitton. In 1978, the Department of Defense, under a routine administrative review, recommended to the families that the 4 men be reclassified from missing in action to presumed killed in action. 3 of the 4 families accepted the change. The 4th was Vera Sitton. Vera Sitton refused. She refused in writing, in a letter sent to the Department of the Army by certified mail, and she refused again in person in the office of her congressman on Mesa Street in El Paso, where she sat for an hour and 12 minutes in a chair across from a young legislative aide who had not yet been born when her son had enlisted. She told the aide that she would not sign any document declaring her son to be dead until somebody, somewhere, produced a body or a piece of one, or some other evidence that satisfied her that he was no longer walking around on the surface of the earth. She told the aide that her son was alive. She did not tell the aide why she believed this. She did not tell the aide, or anybody else, about the dream she had had 3 nights running in the 2nd week after the telegram, in which her son had appeared at the foot of her bed in a strange brown robe and had told her, in a voice that was almost his own and not quite, that he had walked a long way and was not yet finished. The aide noted all of this in a memo and forwarded the memo to the appropriate office. The reclassification was held in abeyance. The case file on Wayne Adam Sitton remained, from that point forward, in a particular drawer of a particular cabinet at the casualty office, where it would not be disturbed for 15 years. Vera Sitton wrote letters. She wrote to congressmen. She wrote to the National League of Families. She wrote to the Defense POW/MIA office. She wrote in a small, careful hand on lined paper, and she signed every letter, Mrs. Hollis Sitton, El Paso, Texas, mother of Specialist Wayne Sitton, missing in action over Laos, January 1971. She received polite responses. She received form letters. She received, occasionally, the telephone number of a casualty officer who could speak with her at her convenience. She kept a binder of all the correspondence in the kitchen drawer next to the silverware, and the binder grew over the years from 1 inch thick to 2 inches thick to 3. In 1992, Hollis Sitton died of an aneurysm at the wheel of his pickup in the parking lot of the feed company where he had worked for 38 years. Vera buried him in the cemetery on the east side of town. She continued to write letters. She was 68 years old in the spring of 1993, when, somewhere on the other side of the world, a junior political officer named Dale Murchison sat across from a monk in a saffron robe in the open-sided sala of a monastery outside Savannakhet, and the monk answered him in English with a Texas drawl, and the cable went up to Vientiane, and from Vientiane to Honolulu, and from Honolulu eventually into the file that had been sitting in the cabinet at the casualty office for 15 years undisturbed. Vera Sitton did not yet know that the cable existed, but she had not stopped believing, not for one day in 22 years, that her son was alive somewhere on the surface of the earth. She had kept his bedroom in the house on Robinson Avenue exactly as he had left it, the El Paso High School pennant on the wall, the paperbacks on the shelf, the photograph of him in his dress greens on the dresser. She dusted it once a week. She did not know how to do otherwise. Murchison drove back to the monastery on his own initiative, 3 weeks after the cable. He had not been authorized to do so. He had not been forbidden to do so either. The cable had gone up the chain and had not, as of that point, generated any response that he was aware of, and he had begun to suspect that it had been filed in some drawer in Honolulu under the heading of unverified and improbable, and would die there. He had not been able to stop thinking about it. He had asked, in casual conversation with a colleague at the embassy, whether anybody knew offhand of a list of MIAs from the Laotian theater, and the colleague had said, "Oh, hell, Dale, there are hundreds of them. Why?" And Murchison had said, "No reason." He drove up on a Friday in the same Land Cruiser as before, the same driver, the same green field notebook in his shirt pocket. The road from Savannakhet town to the monastery was a strip of red laterite that turned to washboard during the dry months and to a bog during the wet, and the Land Cruiser took a little under 2 hours to cover the 30 kilometers. The sky was a high white haze. Buffalo grazed in the rice paddies on either side of the road, the spring planting not yet begun. The monastery looked the same. The same novice was sweeping the same courtyard with the same bundle of twigs. The abbot received him with the same polite attention, the same weak tea, the same offering of a small bowl of rice that he was not expected to actually eat. Murchison sat in the sala on the same cushion as before. He asked, after a polite interval, whether he might speak again with the elderly monk he had met on his previous visit, the one called Pra Somdet. The abbot considered this for a moment. He said, in French, that Pra Somdet was in the back garden, working among the plantains, and that if Murchison wished to walk back there, he was welcome to do so. Murchison walked back. The garden was a half-acre of cleared ground behind the main hall, with rows of plantain and papaya and a small plot of greens, and at the far end of it, in a patch of shade under a tamarind tree, the old monk was sitting on a low wooden stool with a bundle of dry stalks across his knees, weaving them, slowly and carefully, into the shape of a small basket. He looked up as Murchison approached. He did not stand. He did not smile. He waited. Murchison sat down on the bare ground a few feet from him, cross-legged. The way he had been taught was respectful. He said in English, "My name is Dale Murchison. I came to see you 3 weeks ago. I am from the United States." The old monk continued to weave. His hands were brown and weathered and very steady. He said, after a long pause, in English, "I know who you are, son. I remember." Murchison let the silence sit for a moment. He said, "May I ask you some questions?" The monk said, "You can ask. I do not know what I will say." Murchison asked, "Are you American?" The monk weaved another stalk into the basket. He said, "I have not been American in a very long time." That is a true answer. It is not the answer you want, but it is true. Murchison asked, "What is your name?" The monk said, "My name is Pra Somdet." Murchison asked, "What was your name before that?" The monk did not answer for a long time. He worked the stalks. A small green parrot called somewhere in the trees behind the garden. The shadows of the tamarind moved on the dirt. The monk said finally, "I do not say that name any more. I have not said it in many years. I have been told by men older and wiser than me that it is not a useful thing to say." Murchison asked, "Were you in the army?" The monk smiled very faintly for the first time. He said, "Son, every American man my age was in the Army or the Navy or the Marines. That is not a useful question." Murchison asked, "Were you in Vietnam?" The monk stopped weaving. He set the basket down on the ground beside the stool. He looked up, finally, and met Murchison's eye. And Murchison saw, for the first time, that the old man's eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, the kind of blue you see in old men who have spent their lives outdoors in a sunny country, and that the bones of his face, under the skin of an elderly man who had eaten rice and vegetables for decades, were the heavy bones of a tall American. The monk said, "I was in a place that was called Vietnam by the men who flew me there. I was in another place after that. I have been in this place a long time now. This is the only place that is my place. The other places are not my places anymore." Murchison said, very quietly, "Sir, are you Wayne Sitton?" The old monk did not flinch. He did not look away. He held Murchison's eye for a long count of seconds, and then he reached down and picked up the basket again, and resumed his weaving, and said nothing at all. They sat in the shade of the tamarind for another 20 minutes. Murchison did not ask any more questions. The monk did not say anything more. At a certain point, a bell rang in the main hall, a single, low note, and the monk set down the basket and stood up, with the slow, careful unfolding of an elderly man, and bowed once to Murchison, and walked away through the rows of plantain toward the hall, the saffron of his robe moving against the green of the leaves, and then disappearing. Murchison stood up. He had been sitting cross-legged for nearly an hour, and his knees were stiff. He walked back toward the front of the monastery, and as he came around the side of the main hall, he found the old monk waiting for him by the gate. The monk reached out and took hold of the cuff of Murchison's shirt. His grip was light, but it was deliberate. He brought his face close to Murchison's ear, and in a voice that was no louder than a whisper, in a Texas drawl that was unmistakable now and not to be doubted, he said one sentence. He said, "Son, when you write your report, do not write that you found me. Tell my mama that I walked, and that I am still walking, and that I am all right." He let go of Murchison's cuff. He walked back through the gate into the monastery and did not look back. Murchison stood at the gate for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he walked, not quickly, to the land cruiser, and he got in, and he closed the door, and he opened the Greenfield notebook in his shirt pocket, and he wrote down the sentence the old monk had just spoken, word for word, exactly as he had heard it. He wrote it on a fresh page. He underlined nothing. He closed the notebook. He sat for a long time without starting the engine, looking at the dust of the road ahead, and the driver sat beside him and did not ask any questions, because the driver had been with the embassy for 9 years and knew when not to. When Murchison finally drove away, he had not yet decided what he would do with the sentence. He would not decide for a long time, and in fact, he would never, in any official document, in any cable, in any formal memo to any office in any capital, transcribe what the old monk had said to him at the gate of the monastery in Savannakhet on that Friday afternoon in the spring of 1993. The sentence would stay in the Greenfield notebook, and the Greenfield notebook would stay in his desk drawer, and the desk drawer would move with him through 3 more postings and 1 retirement, and that would be the end of it. Or it would have been, if not for what happened 4 months later, when the recovery team finally arrived. The team that came to the monastery was a 4-person element from what was then called the Joint Task Force Full Accounting, the predecessor organization of what would eventually be known as the Defense POW/MIA Accounting Agency. The team arrived in Savannakhet on a Tuesday in the late summer of 1993, 4 months and 11 days after Murchison's original cable. The team was led by an Army major named Lyle Petrosky, a deliberate man in his late 30s who had been doing recovery work in the Southeast Asian theater for almost 5 years, and who had, in that time, walked across a great deal of country and dug up a great many small sites, and learned to maintain, in the face of every kind of partial finding and inconclusive bone fragment, a calm professional skepticism that he wore like a uniform. With him were a forensic anthropologist from the Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii, a Lao-speaking translator from the State Department, and a sergeant whose job was logistics and security and the moving of equipment. They had received the Murchison cable at the JTF-FA office in Hawaii in the spring. The cable had been read, evaluated, and routed to a working group that met every Wednesday to triage incoming reports of possible live sightings or unrecovered remains. The working group had assigned the cable a priority code which translated roughly to credible enough to warrant a site visit, but not credible enough to bump anything else off the schedule. It had taken 4 months to fit the visit into the rotation and to obtain the necessary diplomatic clearances from the Lao government, which was, in that era, sometimes cooperative and sometimes not, and which on this occasion had taken 3 months and a great deal of patient embassy work to bring around. Petrosky had read the cable twice on the flight over. He had read the case file on Wayne Adams Sitton 3 times. He had also read the case file on the entire Lone Star 273 crew and the partially redacted after-action document on the loss of the aircraft, and the strange notation about the radio intercept by Mr. Earl Vandermeer at 0823 on the morning of the incident. And he had, by the time the team's vehicle pulled up to the monastery gate on that Tuesday afternoon, formed no particular opinion about the matter, except that it was likely to be, like most such reports, inconclusive. The abbot received them in the same sala where Murchison had sat, 4 months and 11 days before. The abbot was older than he had been on Murchison's first visit. This was an illusion produced by the season and the light, but Petrosky noticed it. The abbot offered them tea. He answered their questions through the State Department translator, slowly and politely. He said, yes, there had been a man here who fit the description. He had been called Pra-Somdet. He had come to the monastery, the abbot believed, in the early years of the previous decade, possibly 1971 or 1972. The abbot was not certain, as the abbot himself had not been here in those years and was relying on the accounts of the older monks, several of whom had since died. The man had appeared one morning at the gate, sick with fever, his clothing in rags, speaking a language no one understood. He had been taken in. He had recovered. He had eventually requested and received ordination. He had been with them ever since. Petrosky asked, "Where is he now?" The abbot looked down into his tea bowl. He said, after a moment, "Pra-Somdet left the monastery in the early summer of this year. He walked into the forest one morning before dawn, before the morning bell, and he did not return. We searched for him for some days. We did not find him. He was an old man. The forest is a large place. We have, since then, made the offerings that one makes for a brother who is gone. Petrosky asked, "May we see his cell?" The cell was a small room of unpainted plank, perhaps 2.5 meters by 3, with a single high window covered by a wooden lattice. The floor was bare boards. There was a sleeping mat rolled up against one wall, a small wooden bowl on a shelf, a folded saffron robe, a clay water jar. That was all. The forensic anthropologist went through the room slowly and methodically. She lifted the mat. She looked under the boards where they were loose. She examined the inside of the bowl. She examined the lattice of the window. She found, in a small hollow in the joint between two of the floor planks, a single small object wrapped in a scrap of saffron cloth. She brought it to the door of the cell where Petrosky was standing and unwrapped it carefully on the palm of her hand. It was a dog tag. The metal was darkened and discolored from age and from the chemistry of human skin oil and 22 years of tropical moisture. But the stamping was still legible. It read, Sitton, Wayne A., a service number, the letter O, no pref. Petrosky looked at the dog tag for a long time. He did not pick it up. He said to the anthropologist very quietly, "Photograph it in place." She did. They documented the find. They placed the dog tag with the saffron cloth in a small evidence envelope which Petrosky himself initialed and sealed. He went back to the abbot. He said through the translator, "Did Prasumdet leave anything else?" The abbot said no. He said, "Did he take anything with him?" The abbot considered this. He said, "The brothers say that he took only the robe he was wearing and his bowl, which I see is still here, so he did not take that, and a small wooden carving that he had made himself of a horse. He had liked horses. He used to say, sometimes, in the years when he still spoke a little, that where he came from there had been many horses." Petrosky asked, did he ever say where he came from? The abbot smiled, the same faint smile that Murchison had seen across the basket-weaving in the garden. He said sometimes that he came from a place where the river ran along the edge of a great desert. He said it was a long way from here. He did not say its name. We did not ask. It is not the way of our community to ask such things of a man who has come to us out of the forest. The team stayed for 2 more days. They walked the immediate area around the monastery. They interviewed 3 older monks. They found nothing further. The dog tag, sealed in its envelope, went back with them to Vientiane, and from Vientiane to Hawaii, and from Hawaii eventually into a particular drawer in a particular cabinet at the Central Identification Laboratory, where it sits to this day, logged and catalogued and unresolved. Petrosky filed his report. The report concluded that a site visit had confirmed the previous presence at the monastery of an individual matching the general description provided in the original cable, but that the individual had departed the monastery before the team's arrival, and that no further information regarding the individual's identity, origin, or current whereabouts had been developed during the visit. The report noted the recovery of a single dog tag bearing the name and service number of Specialist Wayne A. Sitton, missing in action in the Laotian theater since early 1971, but cautioned that the presence of the dog tag at the site did not in itself constitute proof of the identity of the missing individual, as such items were known to circulate in the region by various means. The case remained open. The case had been open for 22 years. The case continued to be open. In El Paso, on Robinson Avenue, Vera Sitton was eventually informed in a careful telephone call from a casualty officer that a possible lead had been investigated and that no definitive conclusion had been reached. She did not ask many questions. She thanked the officer. She hung up the phone and went into her son's bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. And she did not cry, because she had not cried since the second week of January in 1971, and she did not see any reason to start now. The river gave them up in 2008. The dry season of that year was unusual. The monsoon of the preceding summer had been weak, the rains thin and infrequent, and by the time the dry months had run their course, the Sekong River, which drained the high country of southern Laos and ran south and east into the Mekong, was at the lowest level that anyone in the villages along its banks could remember. Sandbars that had been submerged for decades came up out of the water like the backs of sleeping animals. Old wreckage came up with them. The river had been a place of war once, and the river had been a place of accident and ordinary life always, and the river had been swallowing things for a long time, and now it was, briefly, giving some of them back. The bones came up on a long crescent sandbar about 11 kilometers downstream from a village called Ban Peng. They were found by two fishermen, brothers, who had walked out onto the sandbar at first light to set lines for catfish. The older brother saw first a curve of white that he took for the rim of a broken pot, and then, as he stepped closer, he saw that it was not a pot. The brothers did the right thing, which was to leave the bones where they were and to walk back to the village and to find the headman. And the headman walked out himself to look. And the headman called the district authorities, and the district authorities, who had been trained by then in the protocols for such finds, called Vientiane. 2 days later, a representative from the Lao National Authority came up by truck and looked at the sandbar and confirmed that the find was substantial. Within a week, a request was relayed to the American Embassy in Vientiane, and within a month, an element from the Defense POW/MIA accounting agency was on the ground at Ban Peng with shovels, screens, evidence bags, and the slow, patient methods of forensic recovery. The recovery took 11 days. The team worked from first light to the beginning of the afternoon heat, sifting the sand of the bar through quarter-inch mesh, mapping every find with grid coordinates, photographing in place, bagging, labeling. They recovered in those 11 days the fragmentary remains of 3 individuals. The remains were not complete. The river had moved them, broken them, deposited them on the sandbar over a long span of years. But there was enough. There were 3 skulls. There were portions of 3 sets of long bones, mostly femurs and tibias, in varying states of preservation. There were teeth, which would prove crucial later. There were scraps of metal that had been part of the structure of an aircraft, including a section of perforated steel plate that had once formed part of the floor of a Huey cargo bay, identified by the spacing of its tie-down rings, and a fragment of an aluminum chin bubble that had once let a pilot look down through the floor at the world below his pedals. There was a portion of a survival vest. There was a single boot. There was no identification disc found loose in the sand, but the teeth were enough. The teeth, run against dental records held in Hawaii for the 4 men of the Lone Star 273, gave conclusive matches for 3 of them. The skull and femur fragments matched the dental records of Curtis Weems, of the eastern Tennessee town that had already lost 3 men in Korea. A second set of skull and femur fragments matched the dental records of Roy Thibodeau, of the parish country south of Lafayette. A third set matched the dental records of Glenn Hargrove, of the wheat farm outside Hutchinson, Kansas. The fourth set of records, for Specialist Wayne Sitton of El Paso, Texas, found no match in any of the recovered material. There was no 4th skull on the sandbar. There were no 4th femurs. There was nothing among all the bone and metal that the river had given up after 37 years that could be tied to him. The recovery report, when it was written, was careful in its language. It noted that the recovered remains, the wreckage components, and the geographic location were all consistent with the loss of UH-1H tail number 273, designated Lone Star 273, on the morning of the operation in early 1971. It noted that 3 of the 4 crew members had been positively identified through dental comparison. It noted that no remains attributable to the fourth crew member, Specialist Wayne Sitton, had been recovered. It did not speculate as to why. The remains were repatriated. There was a ceremony at Hickam Air Force Base, on the runway, with the families standing in a line and a chaplain reading from a small leather book, and the 3 flag-draped transfer cases coming down the ramp of the C-17 in the slow, measured way that they always do. Curtis Weems Sr. was there for his son. The Thibodeau family had sent a delegation of 7. Edna Hargrove had died in 1998, but her 2 daughters had come, in dark clothes, and stood holding hands. Vera Sitton had been informed of the recovery. She had been informed, with the care that the casualty officers reserved for such conversations, that her son's 3 crewmates had been identified, and that her son had not. She had been asked whether she wished to attend the ceremony at Hickam in any capacity. She had said, "No, thank you." She had said she would prefer to wait at home. She was 83 years old by then. She still lived in the house on Robinson Avenue. She still kept her son's bedroom as it had always been. She no longer wrote letters, but the binder was still in the kitchen drawer next to the silverware, 3 inches thick, the corners bent and softened by decades of handling. After the casualty officer left her house, on the afternoon they came to tell her about the recovery, she sat at the kitchen table in the late sun, and she put her hands flat on the table the way she had on the day the original telegram had come, and she said out loud to the empty kitchen, in a voice that was steady, "Well, all right then, Wayne. You walked. You walked." She did not know about Murchison. She did not know about the green field notebook. She did not know about the sentence the old monk had spoken at the gate of the monastery in Savannakhet in the spring of 1993. She did not know, and she would not know, because Dale Murchison, whose desk drawer the notebook still inhabited, had not yet decided what to do with it. But she knew, in the way that mothers know, that the river had not given her son back, and she had decided, a long time before, what that meant. Dale Murchison retired from the Foreign Service in the autumn of 2009. He was 50 years old. He had served in Vientiane, in Bangkok, in Phnom Penh, in Yangon, and finally for 3 years on the Laos desk in Washington, and he had grown, over the course of all of those postings, into the kind of senior officer that the State Department needed and did not always know how to keep. And at the end, he had taken the early retirement that was offered to him, and had moved, with his wife Margaret, to a small farmhouse on 5 acres in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, where the fields ran down toward a creek and the porch faced east toward the Blue Ridge. He kept the green field notebook in the top drawer of a roll-top desk in the room he used as a study. The notebook had moved with him through every posting. The cover had softened to the texture of cloth. The page on which he had written the sentence the old monk had spoken at the gate of the monastery in Savannakhet was the 17th page, and the sentence was still there, in his careful handwriting, undated, unattributed, just the words themselves. He had thought, in the years immediately after Savannakhet, that he would eventually do something with it. He had thought he would write a memo, or pass it discreetly to a contact at DPAA, or, at the very least, find an address in El Paso and send a letter, anonymous if necessary, to the mother of Specialist Wayne Sitton. He had thought all of these things at various points over the course of 15 years, and he had not done any of them. He had not done any of them because every time he had taken out the notebook and read the sentence again, he had come up against the same wall, which was that he did not know what was true. He did not know whether the old monk had been Wayne Sitton. The monk had not said so. The monk had explicitly not said so. The dog tag in the cell was suggestive, but, as the recovery team's report had cautioned, not conclusive. The recovery on the Sekong sandbar had been suggestive in the other direction, the absence of a 4th set of remains, but absence was not proof. There were 1,000 ways for a man's bones to be carried by a river or eaten by the country and never to come back. And even if the old monk had been Wayne Sitton, Murchison did not know what the old monk had wanted. He had said, "Do not write that you found me." He had said, "Tell my mama that I walked, and that I am still walking, and that I am all right." Murchison had taken that, in the years afterward, to mean, "Do not put me in your report, and do not give me back to my country, and do not send anyone to find me." But it had also meant, "Tell my mama." It had meant, find a way, somehow, to do that one thing. Murchison had not found the way. He had told himself that he had not been able to find the way, and he understood, in the small, honest part of himself, that this was not the same as the truth. In the autumn of 2012, he read in a small item in the back pages of the El Paso Times, which he had subscribed to online for some years for reasons he had not entirely admitted to himself, that Mrs. Vera Sitton, 87, had passed away at her home on Robinson Avenue, of natural causes, after a long illness. The item said that she was preceded in death by her husband Hollis and her son Wayne, who had been listed as missing in action in the Vietnam War. It said that services would be held at the Baptist Church on Montana Avenue, and that, in lieu of flowers, donations might be made to the National League of Families of American Prisoners and Missing in Southeast Asia. Murchison read the item twice. He printed it. He put it on the desk next to the notebook. He sat at the desk for a long time without writing anything down. His wife came in eventually and stood in the doorway. She said, "Are you all right, Dale?" He said, "I am thinking." She looked at the printed item on the desk and at the open notebook. She did not ask any questions. She had not asked questions about the notebook for almost 20 years. She had understood, a long time before, that the notebook was a thing her husband would tell her about when he was ready to, and that it was not her place to push. He said after a while, "Margaret, I think I have been a coward." She said, "About what?" He said, "About a thing that I should have done a long time ago, that I did not do, and that the person I should have done it for is now dead, and beyond the reach of my doing it. And so the question of whether I was right or wrong is, I suppose, no longer answerable." She came across the room and put her hand on his shoulder. She said, "Dale, you have not always known the right thing to do. Nobody has. You did what you thought was right at the time." He said, "I don't know if I did." She said, "You know what? Make a decision now then. If you cannot do it for her, do it for yourself." He sat at the desk for another hour after she had gone back downstairs. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the printed item. He thought about a sandbar on a river in southern Laos in the dry season of 2008, and 3 sets of bones and a 4th set that was not there. He thought about the old monk in the saffron robe under the tamarind tree, weaving a small basket of dry stalks, and the pale washed-out blue of his eyes, and the heavy American bones under his old man's skin. He thought about a young door gunner on the floor of a UH-1H over a valley in the Annamites, with a Zippo lighter in his pocket, and a feeling about the day, telling his aircraft commander, "Sir, I got a feeling about this one." He thought about the radio intercept at 0823, and Earl Vandermeer in the cockpit of the second Huey writing down the sentence in his kneeboard, "Tell my mama I am going to walk." He thought about the gap between that sentence in the pilot's notation in the after-action document and the sentence in his own notebook on the 17th page. He thought about the difference between a man who said he was going to walk and a man who, more than 20 years later, said he had walked and was still walking and was all right. He did not, in the end, write anything down. He did not call DPAA. He did not contact the Sitton family, what was left of it, the cousins and the second cousins, and the small Baptist congregation in El Paso. He did not write the memo to the State Department historian. He did not publish anything. He did not, in any way that any office or any institution could ever record, do anything at all. He closed the notebook. He put it back in the top drawer of the roll-top desk. He turned off the desk lamp. He walked downstairs to the porch, and he sat with his wife, and they watched the light go out of the Blue Ridge in the long, slow blue of a Virginia evening, and the porch light came on automatically as the dusk came down. And after a while he reached up and turned the porch light off, because he did not want it on, and they sat on for a long time in the dark together without speaking. The dog tag is still in a drawer at the Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii. The case file on Wayne Adams Sitton is still open. The fourth set of remains has never been recovered. The monastery in Savannakhet still stands. The abbot of that period has died, and the novice who swept the courtyard with the bundle of twigs is now an old monk in his own right, and he does not remember the American who came twice in the spring of 1993. What happened to Specialist Wayne Adams Sitton in the early hours of an operation called Crimson Meridian in the watershed of the Sekong in the eastern Laotian panhandle in the early months of 1971 is not, in the strict sense, known. What is known is this: 3 of his crewmates went into the river, and the river kept them and gave them back, after 37 years, in pieces that were sufficient for science to do what science does. The 4th man did not. The 4th man, by some account, said, "Tell my mama I'm going to walk." By another account, more than 20 years later, in a garden behind a monastery in a country where his country was not supposed to have lost any aircraft at all, said he had walked and was still walking and was all right. Whether those accounts describe the same man, and whether that man chose what he became, and whether the choice, if it was a choice, was the action of a coward or of a saint, or of something the war had not provided a category for, are questions that the official record does not answer and was never going to. The river runs on. The monastery stands. The notebook is in the drawer.